Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Joffe Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Joffe Mishlove. This is part one of a two-part series on rational emotive behavior therapy. With me is Dr. Debbie Joffe Ellis, who is the wife of the late Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy, and she is co-author with her late husband of the book, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, as well as an autobiography of Albert Ellis called All Out. In addition, she is an adjunct faculty member at Columbia University Teachers College. Welcome, Debbie.
It's great to be with you. Thank you, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you as well, and to talk about what is your life's work and your late husband's life's work. You know, I had the privilege of interviewing him sometime around 25 years ago, so it's wonderful to be in the studio with you now and to recapitulate this important work. It's really one of the major developments in the field of psychotherapy, and your late husband was regarded as a giant in the field of psychology. Some people regarded him as even more influential than Sigmund Freud.
In fact, in the New York Times, he was described as having had more influence than good old Dr. Freud. Yeah.
Now, the premise behind rational emotive behavior therapy is that if we change the way we think, we can change our lives.
Indeed. Well, when we think in healthy ways, not just changing our thinking, but thinking in healthy ways, which REBT, which is short for Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, teaches us the difference between healthy rational thinking and unhealthy irrational thinking. So the premise, as you indicate, is that when we think in healthy ways, there's change. Why? Because we create healthy emotions. And when we're experiencing healthy emotions, which doesn't necessarily mean happy, uplifting ones, but healthy, appropriate ones, such as sadness and grief when a loved one dies, or a delightful chapter in life ends. That's healthy and very different from what REBT refers to as the unhealthy negative emotions, because they debilitate us, and they include depression, anxiety, rage, shame, and guilt. Yeah, so if a person, given that our life on this planet is finite, wants to minimize pain and emotional suffering, which REBT and most philosophies and psychologies acknowledge, life will contain some loss, pain, and suffering. But if we want to minimize the suffering and not add to it, and thereby maximize joy in life, then in my view, yes, I'm biased, I admit it, but REBT provides a simple, easy to understand formula, methods and techniques easy to adopt, but not only that. It's infused with compassion, more than other cognitive approaches that I know of. It emphasizes the importance of unconditional acceptance and the beauty of cherishing life and adopting a healthy philosophy of life and living.
Well, there's a sense in which, when you talk about alleviating suffering, that REBT is much like Buddhism. The Buddhists seem to be saying that because we have beliefs that are not accurate about ourselves and our environment and other people, we suffer.
Indeed. Yeah. There are many similarities between Buddhism and REBT. And in fact, in Al's final years of life, he and I were giving workshops on rational emotive behavior therapy and Buddhism. Many similarities, but also some striking differences. One of them being that in some schools of Buddhism, or forms of Buddhism, theories of Buddhism, the tenets can sound very absolutistic, such as life is suffering. And REBT, which is non-absolutistic, would say life contains suffering, but to say that it is suffering means that it only is suffering, and that's not the truth for most people most of the time. And so the language is different. Another example might be that some approaches in Buddhism will say that the wise human strives to be or learns to be or even can be in a state of nirvana, a state of perfection. And REBT, in its groundedness and preference for realistic thinking, would say that for most people right now, it seems that it might be unrealistic to think that they must strive to be perfect or in a state of nirvana most of the time or all of the time.
It's more about accepting life with its imperfections.
Indeed, acceptance. And also one more thing that comes to mind is that some approaches in Buddhism encourage people to still the mind, to stop all thoughts. And REBT again is skeptical that most people can do that for any length of time. So rather than talk about stopping the mind, REBT encourages us to use the mind in healthy ways.
Now, I think it's fascinating that a lot of the clinical theories were developed by your late husband based on his own life experiences. And I know that you lived with him probably during the most painful time in his life because you married when he was in his late 80s and he was seriously ill and his health just got worse and worse and worse. So you nursed him through this period and he suffered enormously and you probably were up day and night taking care of him during this very, very difficult time. And both of you applied REBT principles to cope with what almost everyone would have to say are some of the most anguishing circumstances any person can go through.
Indeed. Yeah, Jeff. And that's why I find great joy in doing what I do these days, because I practice what I preach. And that gives me a very genuine belief in what I do. I'm not just spouting a theory that's attractive to me. I have been severely tested and applied it and have benefited by doing so, in that my physical health remained steady, luckily. I didn't suffer from excessive stress. I was able to keep a stability and cope with things I needed to do in my day-to-day life. I was not debilitated, and a number of people, knowing some of the challenges that we, and then after Al died, I endured, were amazed. And to use the kind of New York lingo that Al used to use, possibly and probably thanks to my application of REBT, I didn't end up in a loony bin.
Well, I recall in some of the correspondence between you and your late husband that was published in the autobiography, he actually criticized you for caring about him more than you cared about yourself.
I admire your memory. You do such great research. He did actually in the letter, and also when we spoke. I've always had a tendency to be excessively sensitive. I mean, from childhood on, if I saw a vulnerable looking little animal, or if a child at school was being picked on, I'd come home and cry on my dad's shoulders for ages and ages. I seem to have had from way back a tendency to feel suffering. And Al said it's a beautiful quality to have sensitivity, but to take care that I wasn't too sensitive. So it wasn't about dulling myself. It was about feeling what I feel, and rather than drowning and exacerbating the pain, to feel what I feel and to think about it. What can I do about this? Is there a way of seeing it that's realistic, but that can elevate me from my devastation about the suffering? And so it was Al being Al. He knew me so well. I mean, from the time I met him, the first time was when I was a psychology student. He was Albert Ellis, and I was a student. But people around, because he came to Australia, I'd studied at Melbourne University, and he was on a speaking tour, and I took his workshops, and I met him there. Little did I think I'd end up marrying him. But most people around, because he had a gruff manner and a way of speaking, and because he was a genius and brilliant, most people, professors and fellow students, felt intimidated by him. And for whatever reason, I sensed the gentleness, the good-heartedness within. I never felt any intimidation. I, in fact, felt that I'd known him forever. And again, when we first met, I never would have imagined that I was going to marry the man. That perhaps my experience of feeling I knew him, maybe he shared that as well. And without my having to tell him much about anything, he picked up on my sensitivity. So indeed, he would recommend to me, and probably to anyone who he noticed was suffering too much angst and pain, to not get rid of that cherished quality of being sensitive to others, but not to let it devastate one.
And I'm under the impression maybe he also felt we each have a responsibility to take care of ourselves first.
Yes, yeah. Now, when you describe what I did, and it sounds perhaps like a noble sacrifice, and I didn't see it that way.
Yeah. Well, he writes how you saved his life more than once. I
adored the man. And it wasn't a thought, shall I or shan't I? It was a natural thing.
But and also I have to think that in order to cope with those extreme circumstances, you were under pressure financially, you were under pressure, of course, medically. His condition was devastating. Amazingly, he continued to teach and work with patients and see students, and even from a hospital bed.
Yep.
But in order to do that, it requires, without falling apart, it requires a certain self-possession, a sense of oneself. You're not going to be able to cope with these kinds of circumstances if you're flying off the handle.
Indeed, and not only, in all probability, would most people in such circumstances not cope very well, but they may act in ways that make the situation worse.
Yeah.
And make the suffering of themselves and others worse. So all round, it serves a human being well when they're in shocking or brutal or painful circumstances, to take time to steady themselves and be aware of what they're feeling and what they're thinking that's creating the feeling. And if it's a feeling that's interfering with a smooth progress, moment to moment, day to day, to think about changing that thinking, not into a Pollyanna, everything will be fine, because often everything isn't fine or won't be fine. But it can be better, and it can be manageable. And even if an outcome of a particular circumstance is undesirable, shocking, or tragic, by being willing to remember that if I have my awareness, if I have my life, I can cope. There are other humans who have gone through equivalently brutal things or worse, and they have coped. And the way most people who cope with brutality and shocking events cope is by clinging to some hope that this too will pass and things can get better, and to the belief in human resilience.
Mm-hmm. Now, for example, and it's probably a classic example, your parents were both Holocaust survivors.
Yes.
And they somehow instinctively learned how to cope. They didn't go through REBT.
No, they did not. And that's another thing that I love about REBT. Really, it's wisdom. Take away the title and it's wisdom.
Mm-hmm. It's based on ancient philosophy.
Al acknowledged his many influences, which include ancient philosophers, the Stoics, Eastern philosophy, Confucius, Lao Tzu, contemporary philosophers of his time like Dewey and Bertrand Russell. Alfred Adler was an influence, and there were many others. I won't take time.
Well, probably most famously, Epictetus.
Epictetus.
Who was a slave, a philosopher and a slave. And he, if I recall correctly, he maintained that it didn't matter that he was a slave. He could still have his integrity. And no one could take that away from him. No circumstance could take away his own inner being.
Indeed. And Al very much lived that way as well. Just to fast forward to the end of his life on that point, and then I'll mention my parents, which you originally asked about a few months ago. At the end of Al's life, he was severely tested, as you indicated. Not only was his health in decline, but things which to him were shocking were happening within his work environment, in his institute, and it was the greatest sadness, that period of his life, that he ever had experienced. And he was quoted in, it was either New York Magazine or the New York Times, as saying, regarding the people in our work environment who are acting in ways that he found shocking. I hate what they're doing, but I don't hate them. And Jeff, I know for a fact, because I was with him 24/7, except when I was showering, going to the toilet, or sleeping briefly. He actually had compassion for them. After one situation that I was extremely upset about, and the tears are flowing, Al said to me, Debbie, you're such a good practitioner of REBT. You teach it, you apply it, but you're not applying it now regarding my sadness. He said, accept. They have to act the way they're acting when they're thinking the way that they're thinking. Accept. And that really helped put things in perspective for me. And so he, like Epictetus, in dire circumstance, practiced what he preached. And back to my parents, if I tell you just briefly their amazing story, each one of them, a golden-hearted, superb individual in their own right. So they were childhood sweethearts. My mum a mere 19 and Dad about 21. Just before the war, they married. And then, leaving out a ton of details, they were put in different, first in the same concentration camp, and my father was in the male barracks and my mother the female, and every night he would sneak across and give her his crust of bread or potato or onion to eat, really risking his life. And then one night he didn't come, and he never came anymore. And as the years went on, the next 5 years, they were both in various camps, and each one assumed the other had been killed. Most of their other family members were killed. At the end of the war, by miraculous happenstance, my mother's brother, my uncle, who was 15 when the war started and he became a member of the underground partisans. He found her. So it's the two of them after the war. They had each other, and what do we do now? And they're talking to someone, and my mother mentions her married name, Joffe. Joffe, there's a Joffe. I know, he's going on the train tonight to Austria. So my mum and my uncle rush to the train station, which is 60 miles away. The train is warming up. They run through all the carriages, and at the very last carriage, there's a man asleep, and it's my dad. So what a reunion. Again, cutting the long story, they have an uncle in Australia, organises visas. They move to Australia and start a new life there. A number of other Holocaust survivors started a new life there. A number of them, my parents' friends, went through what was then known as nervous breakdowns. Mm-hmm. They suffered from deep depression. Mm-hmm. My parents did not. What was the difference? Putting aside biological components, which certainly contribute, but I think a major factor was that my parents focused on what was good. They survived. They found each other. They had their children. You know, in Australia, they had a new life. Of course, at times, they recalled the past and shed tears. But their primary focus, despite the horrors of what they endured, and if we had 3 hours, I'd tell you some of them, they focused on the joy of life and what they were grateful for. The people who suffered, their friends who I witnessed, focused on what had been and who they had lost more of the time. Mm-hmm. So, yes, REBT philosophy, we have a choice, most of us, if the biological components are not overwhelming, about what we focus on. And if we choose to focus on not Pollyanna, but what in reality is good, then we strengthen our immune system, we're healthier, we're happier more of the time, and life is enriched.
Mm-hmm. And there's, at this point in time, a great deal of research suggesting that, for example, people suffering from depression are improved by this rational cognitive approach.
Indeed, indeed. And also research is showing the benefit of gratitude, and that people who experience awe in life are healthier, physically, mentally, emotionally.
Experiencing awe.
AWE, my funny accent, right? That something is awesome, fabulous, who have the ability and willingness to, instead of being caught up in their needs and problems and challenges, not to put that aside, but to also notice a beautiful sunrise, sunset, be in gratitude, experience that awe.
This is one of your contributions to the work, I gather, because when I interviewed your late husband some 25 years ago, he talked about the necessity for people to avoid what he called awfulizing more than moving into awe.
Well, two sides of the same coin, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Indeed. What I just said, I have no doubt my husband would agree with. He may not have taken the time to talk as much as I do at times about the importance of gratitude and marvel and awe, but he agreed with it. And one of the reasons, by the way, I do that in my passion and mission to continue to share the wisdom of REBT with as many people as I possibly can, is that in this day and age, I think it important that people consciously realize the benefit of choosing to create healthy emotions and think in healthy ways by being grateful, because there are more threats. Not that there weren't in the past, in every generation, but I don't need to spend time talking about the fears because of the terrorists and the random things that seem to be happening in public places and other stressors in life. And so, in addition to the other tenets of REBT that I love to share because they're elegant and simple, I do perhaps emphasize more than Al did the role of gratitude and awe. And what he did do very strongly, and I continue to do, is also emphasize the importance of unconditional acceptance, which other cognitive approaches that came after Al's approach really heralded in the cognitive revolution in psychology. And his, more than others that I know of, emphasizes the importance of unconditional acceptance. The other approaches might not disagree, but they don't push.
It's sort of central to REBT.
It surely is.
Unconditional self-acceptance, unconditional acceptance of others, and unconditional acceptance of life itself.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know a lot of people feel that not only is it tough, but it might even be dangerous. You can't unconditionally accept all of the horrors of the world. There are many people who criticize it, perhaps because they don't understand that accepting another person, for example, unconditionally does not mean you accept all of their behavior.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It doesn't mean you're condoning it. It doesn't mean you're kind of adopting a position of, oh, well, and being blasé. No, REBT is all for a healthy life, which includes striving for justice when we see there is injustice, either for ourselves or in a broader community.
And Al was very well known for taking on unpopular causes.
Yeah, way back in the 1940s. He was heterosexual, well, for all of his life, and yet he loudly was for equal rights for gays. Mm-hmm. Not many people were doing that back then.
No, he was severely criticized at the
and
time.
How? And called the devil many times throughout his life for various reasons.
Well, Debbie, Joffe, Ellis, our time is running out now, but thank you so much for sharing this half hour with me.
It's such a great pleasure. Thank you, Jeff.
And thank you for being with us. Be sure to check your listings for part 2 of our 2-part series on rational emotive behavior therapy.